Guys, so today we're going to be doing geologic history. Actually, over the next couple of days, we're going to be doing geologic history. After that, we're going to begin our review. So what you need today is page 3, page 8, and page 9 in your reference table. Handy, ready to go. Once we start review, it's going to probably be little by little, like your quests have been. We're going to get some practice problems. We're going to have some extra help times. That's pretty much how we're going to do it. Your geologic history you've been working on with your project. So most of you guys should have your projects done by now. Hopefully you have both parts completed and they're fun and you guys had fun doing, especially the commercials. I guess I will see you soon, hopefully. Have a good one, guys.
So as I said, we're going to be talking about geologic time. We're going to be talking about that deep time that we mentioned last week. So what are we talking about? Well, when we're talking about the geologic time scale, we're talking about the history of the Earth. Not the history you've learned of George Washington and Louis XIV and Xerxes and all these other times, but we're talking deep time, very long time. The 4.6 billion year history of our planet. Okay, and we call it the geologic time scale. So remember, we're going to have to use those units of time that are a little different. We're going to have to be talking about millions and billions of years. Remember, the abbreviations that we use are either MYA for millions of years or BYA for thousands of years. So when we look at the geologic time scale, what we do is we break down the geologic time scale into different units. Makes it a little bit easier to work with. We have what we call eons, which are the longest possible unit of time. We have eras. We have periods, and we can also break these periods down into even smaller periods of time that we call epochs. Okay, so when we talk about an eon, eons are usually made up of, we measure them usually in billions of years. Okay, and so we have what we call, now this chart uses the term pre-Archean. That's a little bit weird. We don't really actually use that term anymore. We use the term Hadean. We'll get to that in a second. We have the Archean Eon, we have the Proterozoic Eon, and then we have the Phanerozoic Eon. Now, this chart's a little bit confusing because if you look, you go, oh, these time periods are much shorter. No, if you look at it, these time periods, this one goes from the beginning, so 4.6 billion to 3.8 billion. That's a long period of time. This one, right, you're going from about 3.8 to about 2.5 billion. You're talking billions of years. Once again, this one 2.5 to 570 million, see, million years ago, okay? And then this one only runs from about 570 million to the present day. So even though this one looks like it's the longest period of time, it's actually not. It's just we know a lot more about what's going on here because we have a lot more of the rock samples, and this is the time when we see life, okay? When we talk about eras, okay, the three main eras, there are eras back here, but you don't need to know them. The three main eras we have are the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, and the Cenozoic era. And then the periods that you have are all listed here. Now, you do not have to remember all these. Why? Because all of these eons and eras and periods and epochs are in your reference table. If you open up your reference table to page 8 and 9, you will see these two pages. Keep it open and lay it side to side so you can follow what's going on. Now, yours isn't color-coded, but feel free to color-code it if you want, if it makes it a little easier for you to track it. Now, if you look here we have what we were talking about. We have our different breakdowns in time. We have our eon, we have our era, and we have our period. And we even have epochs on this chart. Okay, so now if you look here, this gives you a little bit better. Now, they kind of break down this whole chunk of time into a term that we used to use that's called the Precambrian. We don't use that term very often anymore in scientific circles, but the region still does from time to time, so it's familiar that you use it. The Precambrian basically goes from the formation of the Earth about 4.6 billion years ago to about 550, 570 million years ago. So the bulk of the time that the Earth was around is this Precambrian. Now, if you look here, you'll actually see the terms that we talked about. You've got Archean here, and you've got Proterozoic here. Okay? The Hadean would be down here at the beginning. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? Now, if you look at this chart, you've got your eras, like we talked about here, Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic. You got your periods. Each of you has one of these for your project, so that should seem familiar to you guys. And then each period can get broken down into an epoch. So eon is the longest. Eras are usually hundreds of millions of years. Periods are usually tens of millions of years. And epochs usually are tens of thousands to a couple of million years, depending on what you're talking about. Okay, now this chart's incredibly useful. We're going to use it a lot for the regions. Okay, and for your test next week and in general, you have life on Earth sitting here. Okay, these are all the different forms of life that you have that came into existence during your time, so please make sure. Okay, and this life on Earth actually will usually work quite well with the column that you see here. I'll skip this one for a second. Okay, you have the time distribution. These are your index fossils, and they are listed down at the bottom. Each letter corresponds to a particular type of index fossil. So if you see the different letters here, okay, and so that letter indicates, so A, for example, was around here. So when was it around? Well, you'd have to go, okay, A was around during the Cambrian period. Okay, and the Cambrian period, if you look right there, you've got your time frames right there and right there. It's a little blurry on my screen, but you should be able to read it clearly on yours. Okay, and so you can use these index fossils to help you figure out time periods. Okay, test questions are often going to ask you. They'll give you a picture of one of these fossils down here, and they'll ask you to figure out a particular time period, or when something came older, or first, or second, or last. Okay, so you have to be able to use both of this chart down at the bottom in combination with this section here, in combination with here. So you're going to have a lot of moving parts with this chart. Okay, here, the column that I skipped is the New York State rock record. Now, when we talk about New York State, you've got gaps. What do we call a gap? Unconformities. There are unconformities. There are chunks of the rock record that have gone missing because of weathering and erosion and things like that. Now, we've got a nice chunk from a little bit before the Cambrian all the way through the Carboniferous, but see, there's a gap there. Then we've got a little bit of Pennsylvanian, and then we've got a gap, a little bit there, gap, gap. Okay, so those are unconformities. The last two columns are also important. You've got your important geologic events in New York. Okay, everything that happens. You've got all these pictures represent that you see like this. These are going to be mountain forming events. So we talked about those last week. Those are called Orogenes or Orogenesis. Okay, and they tell you when it was happening. And once again, you can match it up with the timelines that you're given here. So if you use the time windows, remember the times are really important. If I skipped over that, I apologize. They're all listed right here. So that gives you the actual time. Now it's in millions of years, so when it goes into thousands of millions of years is just billions of years. Okay? And these are orogenes, these are the formations of different sills, certain meteor impacts and things like that. The last thing is the inferred positions of the Earth's landmasses. So basically, where was North America and other things during these particular time periods? And so they give you kind of a little map here. And there's North America. That's the equator. So at this time, the bulk of North America was actually below the equator, along with most of the land masses. And you can see how it slowly drifted north and west. Okay? So it's really important that you know how to read this chart. Now, that's going to lead us into this lovely chart. We talked about this a whole bunch of times, but we've always told you to ignore the symbols. Well, we're not going to tell you to ignore the symbols anymore. Why? Because, like we talked about, you've got the New York State rock record on that chart. Well, here it actually is in living color, or at least black and white color, I should say. Okay? If you look down here at the key, this tells you when the rocks were formed. Now, it gives you the names of the different time periods. Okay? The youngest being up here, the oldest being down here. You have to be able to match the symbol with the time period with the charts on pages 8 and 9. So for example, if we look here, right around Niagara Falls and Rochester and Syracuse, this whole bank right here, see how the lines are these vertical lines? So what does that tell us? That tells us that we are most likely looking at rocks from the Silurian period. When is the Silurian period? Well, we'd have to go back to this chart, find the Silurian period, and there are your number values. So that tells you when those rocks were formed. Okay? It tells you the types of rocks that you have, and it tells you whether they've, sedimentary, metamorphic, heavily metamorphized, and stuff like that. Okay? You can use this chart to figure out where the oldest rocks are and things like that. So like we mentioned, the first Eon is what we call the Hadean. Okay? And the Hadean literally means hell earth. And it was during this time that the earth formed, like you see in the image above, from a ball of loose material into the solid or semi-solid rocky mass that we have today. Okay, now when we look at the Hadean, the other big thing that happened was the formation of the moon, the Theia impact. This happened about 4.5 million years ago. We saw this. We talked about this earlier in the year. The Earth got hit by an object named Theia, and eventually our moon formed. It was much, much closer to the Earth. Now, if we look at the actual Earth during this time, the Earth looked dramatically different. The surface was not solid at all. You had tons and tons of volcanism going on, and that volcanism actually caused outgassing, which formed the first atmosphere. So our first atmosphere was formed by this process known as the outgassing, and the atmosphere is dramatically different from what we have today. Now, the thing that was missing on Earth during this time was primarily water, and that water was brought here by something called the Late Heavy Bombardment. And the Late Heavy Bombardment happened right around 4 billion years ago. About 4 billion years ago, the Earth got hit over and over and over and over again by thousands and millions of meteors and asteroids and comets. And inside each one of these was a little bit of water, which eventually contributed to the water that we have. So all the water that you drink, all the water that you see, all the water that you have came during this period from about 4.1 till about 3.8 billion years ago. Now, when we look at the Hadean, we actually find the oldest known rocks. The oldest known rocks are called the Acasta gneiss, and they are from northwestern Canada. Okay, and they are heavily metamorphosed rocks, which you can see in front of you right now. The second eon we're going to talk about is the Archean. The Archean runs from about 3.8 to about 2.5 million years ago, and during this time, the Earth became a water world. The first organisms evolved called stromatolites. Those were colonies of bacteria, and slowly and surely over time they changed the atmosphere again by starting to produce oxygen, and you can actually see them in front of you now. The next eon we're going to talk about is the Proterozoic Eon, which runs from about 2.5 billion years ago to 542 million. Notice the billion to million switch. The important geologic event that happens during this time is what we call the Greenville orogeny, from about 1.5 to about 1.1 billion years ago. And this was a mountain building event. That's what orogeny means. That created the Adirondack Mountains in northern New York State. And not only did it create the mountains there, but it actually created mountains all the way from Canada all the way down to Texas. Okay? Now, the other major event that's happening in this is obviously the evolution of life. You're going from very simple one-celled creatures to much more complicated and complex creatures. And in fact, eventually you get the first multicellular creatures, which are going to have a huge, huge impact on the world. Life already did at this point. In fact, the byproducts of life, of cellular respiration, the oxygen that's being produced, is slowly changing the atmosphere and leads to one of the first major extinction events. All right, guys, so we're going to move on to part 2 of this video so we can get through the rest of the geologic history and hit some points on that map again. I want to get through it so that we can get through the material as fast as we can so we can start our review. All right, so see you in a second.